Good afternoon, everybody, people present. If you see someone hanging around in the waiting room and you can let them in, you please do it. Questions in the chat, please. That'll be good. And then we'll have, after the presentation, we have a few minutes again for people to talk. So we'll introduce you to Dr. Owen Missen. He's a lecturer in environmental geology in the School of Earth Sciences at the UTAS, and he's working on the environmental mineralogy and geochemistry of key critical elements such as cobalt and tellurium in the oxidation zone. He is conducting research in the Regional Research Collaboration for Environmentally Sustainable Production of Critical Minerals and favors a multidisciplinary approach to mineralogical research, linking techniques such as SEM, ICP-MS, laser ablation and single particle, and synchrotron X-ray techniques. So with you guys, Dr. Missen.
Thank you, Nadia, for the introduction. It's great to be here. Great to give this presentation today, and thank you all for joining online. And if you've afterwards, it'll be online as well uploaded, so feel free to share then more widely with other people who might be interested in regolith chemistry of cobalt. So this is one of the ARGA seminars, so the Australian Regolith Geoscientists Alliance, so one of the specialist groups of the GSA. We meet every month and also do a bunch of webinars and a few other events through the year. So if you're interested in surface chemistry and the regolith in general, then feel free to get in touch with us. Either Anna Petz, our chair, or Nadia, or I, Leah Linham. Quite a few of us around working that are interested in surface environments. So always looking for more members to work and explore this important part of geology. So today I'll be talking to you about the environmental chemistry of cobalt across the Australian semi-arid regolith. I'm now working in Tasmania, which doesn't have much semi-arid regolith. You'll probably not be surprised to hear. So there'll be future work on linking more of that different climatic kind of conditions in the surface environments and what happens in those kinds of places. But today I'll be talking about the semi-arid parts of Australia. There we go, perfect. So for this study, it was actually one that was conducted through my first postdoc at Museums Victoria. The funding was obtained by Dr. Stuart Mills from Greg and Glenda Lewin, AM, plus Geological Society of Australia. The collaborators there included collaborators in Austria for the single particle ICP-MS, as well as the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility, ESRF, one of the many synchrotrons in Europe. Australia, of course, only has the one at the moment in Melbourne. I'd also like to acknowledge my UTAS team for allowing me to continue working on this project in the background while doing the main work on critical metals. And also for this project, site access from NT Minerals and Cobalt Blue Holdings, greatly appreciated, among many other people who helped with mineral collecting, access, how to get to certain places, always very important to the overall success of a given study. So I really see cobalt as an archetype critical element. It's got the huge demand in batteries. 50% of global use goes into that application at the moment. There's pretty well documented supply issues, including some good books and documentaries about the challenges faced in the DRC, or Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's generally a minor element in deposits of other metals. And there are many deposit types from both sulfide hosted to oxide hosted, and you'll see some of the surface geochemistry of those today. And is also typically difficult to process from ores. There's lots of different ore types, and a great review by DeHaene et al. 2021 is a good place to go if you're interested in cobalt geometallurgy. Here shown are some cobalt-rich manganese oxides in Calvert in Northern Territory, one of the sites we visited. And on the lower right, you've got one of those many images of the artisanal type mining. Artisanal literally means the love of, but it's, in those cases, it's people that are basically the only way to make a living is through poorly paid hand mining of cobalt. I always like to show these kinds of diagrams as well. This is one from Simon Jowett, and very prolific author on the critical metals sphere. This is the portion of the diagram that includes all the different critical metals that can be included. It's worth noting that essentially anything could be critical. It's more of a geopolitical term. It's not a scientific term. You can't say, oh yes, group 16 of the periodic table is critical. It's more about what we need and when we need it. And often it's really just relating to who globally controls supply. And you look at those geopolitical alliances. China's been very good at producing different critical metals compared to some other elements. So it's an important one there. And that's often where metals in Australia or USA are considered critical. Things like tungsten, for instance, there's a large supply control through China, and Australia and US hardly produce any at all. So it's often more of a geopolitical thing, though, and in the end, the research side of things is much more collaborative than it might be appear from when you read news reports. But cobalt and lithium are two that are widely seen as critical for a wide range of reasons. And you've also got other metals that won't talk about much today, like indium, PGEs, and the rare earth elements that are also viewed as critical across most jurisdictions. So cobalt's normally found with lithium, so you don't just need one, you often need both in things like lithium cobalt oxide for batteries. So cobalt really is an uncommon transition metal. It's often found substituting for other transition metals like iron, manganese, and to some extent nickel as well. You've got two main oxidation states for cobalt. It's also one of those critical elements that's actually also biologically essential. That's not why it's listed as critical, that's because it's battery uses, but we all have some cobalt inside us, down at the center of what they call cobalamin complexes in vitamin B12. So we need it for anything involved in vitamin B12. You're thinking cobalt as it's what it can do as a metal in an organocobalt form. Crustal abundance of cobalt is 25 parts per million. There's been 67 minerals described for cobalt. We'll come back to that later. A large portion of those are either with sulfur or arsenic. Arsenic can pose its own challenges in terms of processing cobalt. You don't want a high amount of arsenic left over afterwards in wastes, or worse, going through to the smelter. So it's an element you normally have to remove and account for in some way. Now, with all these increased amounts of usage of elements like cobalt, and other ones I've worked on are things like tellurium, we're having greater release of cobalt to the environment just by virtue of being dug up, moved around, and then being used in various applications. There's overall higher levels of metals in the environment now compared to 200 years ago. Lead is the classic example of that, also arsenic, but we'll start seeing it for critical metals as well, particularly things like cobalt that have quite a wide usage in batteries. The common primary ore body association with arsenic doesn't help either. And we have questions around disposal of cobalt containing materials, and also in places like the DRC, as we saw before from an image in the one here, the biogeochemical cycle of cobalt can actually start involving humans. It's not just yes, microbes can be involved, but humans breathing in cobalt, copper-rich dust will end up with some of those in higher amounts in their systems as well. So some quite important questions to ask and hopefully answer about the impact of cobalt on as a contaminant, and also within living creatures. So the classic example of a cobalt oxide deposit is cobalt nickel laterite deposits. These are essentially nickel deposits with some cobalt, but the cobalt can be high enough to produce in certain cases. These are most common in tropical environments, defined as within 26 degrees latitude of the equator, and higher nickel grades than cobalt. So nickel tends to be sort of in the 1% or so range. Cobalt might be around 0.08% as a median. Occasionally it is a bit higher. And some of these places that produce lateritic cobalt are Indonesia, New Caledonia, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Brazil. So you can see there's quite a regional focus there. So lots of the sites in the Pacific or wider Pacific region, close neighbors to Australia. In Indonesia, nickel and cobalt have one of the challenges currently for overall supply of elements like nickel in Australia, because the price you can produce a lateritic nickel in Indonesia is cheaper than you can in Australia. And this is an example of regolith enrichment producing mineral deposits. So where does this cobalt nickel come from? It comes from weathering of ultramafic outcrops, and then they form new clays or oxides in the regolith environment up near the surface. So it can be quite easily accessed, but actually mining them is a challenge, because it will, in some challenge at least in terms of environmental aspects, because you'll have a wide surface footprint to get that lateritic cobalt and nickel out. Now we also end up with cobalt in the regolith from mining in general. So this is some examples from Mount Lyell in Tasmania, where copper's been mined up for over a century. It's been in care and maintenance for the last 10 years, but there's still a lot of mining potential there. But in the meantime, and for a long time before that, cobalt in the form of cobalt and pyrite was just being sent down the Queen River as tailings disposal till 1994. And a lot of that cobalt has ended up down at the King River Delta, which you can see on satellite view is a rather impressive, but in a bad way, orange outcrop at the head of the King River into Macquarie Harbour. And that pyrite contains an average up to thousands of ppm cobalt, but the average in that harbour is about 350 ppm cobalt, so 0.035%. That's quite enough in some cases to be considered as a resource. If you have a very large deposit, IOCG deposits might only have that sort of amount of cobalt, but that can be enough if it's a large tonnage to consider it as a resource. So we do have cobalt in regolith environments from primary deposits too, where ordinarily it wouldn't have ended up in the environment as much as, say, in a laterite. But through mining process, moving rocks around to access a different resource, cobalt has come out as a byproduct and is now firmly in the environment. Question is, what do you do about it? So for Australia, cobalt, like many elements, the main concentrations are in WA. So you've got cobalt over places like Murrin, which is currently 57% of Australia's cobalt output, 3.3 out of 5.8 thousand tonnes. That's not a lot because there's 1.7 million tonnes of cobalt available as resources in Australia, but those are currently mostly not being produced. Other spots of interest include central New South Wales and places like Mount Isa as well, with Mount Isa inlier. We'll see an example of that later on in today's talk. There's new projects like the one over in Western New South Wales, marked on the map as Railway. There's 3 cobalt deposits there that are being looked at in cobalt and pyrite by Cobalt Blue as part of the Broken Hill Cobalt Project. More broadly, this can be a separate talk and study in itself, so I won't dwell on it too much, but manganese and iron can host the cobalt and nickel in oxyhydroxides or just oxides. There's quite a complex chemistry there. Anyone's looked at manganese oxides know it's a pretty complex group of minerals, and iron oxyhydroxides isn't far behind. They can both host cobalt and nickel by adsorption or structural incorporation in different oxidation states. So lots of +2, +3 swapping around, and manganese +4 gets involved as well. And you've also got that behavior happening in the ocean. Very brief mention of ferromanganese nodules here. So you can have quite high cobalt values down in the deep ocean too. And some companies are looking at deep ocean mining, but at the moment it's still a very disputed area whether this can really help supply our critical metal needs or not. And you also get cobalt forming its own minerals when you get highly enriched amounts of cobalt in the oxide forms, things like heterogenite, which can occur quite large percentages in places like the DRC. So I'll talk mostly for the rest of this seminar about the regolith cobalt study I was doing as part of my first postdoc. About half the results are published. There's more to come when I have more chance to work on this, and it'll be more about the biology and overall chemistry in that case. This is about the cobalt's association with manganese particularly, and also its association and in the regolith environments there as nanoparticle forms. That's the 2 things I've looked at so far. That's the paper details. Very happy to, might pop that link up a bit later if I get the chance, but it's an open access paper, so you can download that and have a look at your leisure. So sampling locations, lots of different spots here. I left Tasmania off the map in this figure because we didn't go there for that study, but now I'm down there. So last time I leave Tasmania off a map, I suspect. We drove all the way from Melbourne to take all the gear we needed. So it's this nice long 10,000 kilometer trip to get to all these different sites, doing a big round trip to different parts of the country that otherwise you may not see. So we've got the cobalt sulfarsenide localities in Queensland, known as Queen Sally and Mount Cobalt. Northern Territory, some oxide-hosted lateritic surface profile types, Copperado and Calvert, down to a carbonate-hosted Young's Cobalt prospect near Blinman, SA in the Flinders Ranges, and finally a pyrite-hosted deposit in Broken Hill area. So we're particularly interested in the mineral chemistry here, not so much underlying geology of the deposit, just understanding what the different mineralogy is, the outcrops, and then you can look at the regolith cobalt behavior there. Of course, putting those 2 things together is important, but we're mainly looking at that top meter or so. Once things are actually exposed, what happens in the environment, and then can we use that as an analog for what happens to cobalt in areas where we're artificially concentrating at places like a battery disposal facility, for instance. There's also a question here, all that driving, if you're actually accessing some of these cobalt resources, there's some challenges, particularly on roads. Some of these, if they were to be developed as cobalt resources, would need quite significant road infrastructure upgrades to get to these sorts of places, because otherwise you find you have issues with things like tires getting hit by nice potholes. That's the middle top, was one from our trip. On the left-hand side are 2 ABC articles about various roads not being sealed in Central Australia. The other 4 images are examples of roads in what we encountered, and some of the challenges we had. You don't want to be changing tires on trucks all the time if you're going up to Red Bank area in Northern Territory, for instance. So sampling locations, these are just to show some basic pictures of the areas, seeing some semi-arid environments, some of the weathering. So this is Mount Cobalt. Hasn't been mined for cobalt for quite a while, but it was produced there decades ago. You've got cobalt oxide, arsenate kind of crusts on some of the samples. So the pink color is normally things like erythrite, maybe Mansfieldite. Mount Cobalt once produced cobalt, but now you don't have much except the rusted equipment, but there's potentially more underground there that could be produced if people get really into cobalt and the price is surging. Challenge here, of course, mentioned a couple of times, lots of arsenic, that needs to be managed as a byproduct. But the arsenic is pretty, even if it's an unfortunate association. So these are some pictures from Mindat for cobalt minerals at Mount Cobalt. Arsenates like erythrite, it's a cobalt arsenate, and then 8 water molecules in the crystal structure, and others like smolyaninobite, and also cobalt can go into things like the aluminium arsenate mineral Mansfieldite to get these lovely pink spheres, or these flattened spheres of cobalt oxidation minerals that form on the surface of cobalt ores. We also went into the laterite area in the Northern Territory. So this was once the Red Bank copper mine, which has some significant environmental issues of its own. And there's a couple of different projects around there looking at the Wallagarang project and also the Red Bank project, which has mainly for copper, but there's also potentially some cobalt in the region as well. We didn't get all the way up north to Stanton, and so there was no one up there at the time, but there is some cobalt sulfide mineralization up there. But we were looking mainly at the cobalt oxide outcrops, which occur through the Red Bank project area. Carbonate-hosted deposit at Blinman in SA. It's a very small little prospect, but gave us another chance to look at some surface mineralogy of different sort of cobalt. Didn't see any minerals visible. This is the landscape nearby. The actual deposit itself looks like people had dug through the little area that it outcropped, and there wasn't much left to see, but there was still some cobalt visible in the regolith. And finally, surface pyrite-hosted cobalt in Mount Cobalt. Got these outcropping boulders that are quite rich in pyrite, and they have this oxidation crust around them. So there is some cobalt getting into the surface areas there, and then that can potentially provide a proxy for finding where the cobalt might have traveled in low levels into the nearby areas. And this is currently a project under significant development and looking for an Australian source of cobalt production, which I think has shown some very promising results from what I have heard from Cobalt Blue. So hopefully this will be one that will actually be a production in the future for cobalt in Australia. So one technique we looked at is microbial analysis, and these results mainly are still to come. So it's just worth having a look at what the surface microbial populations are in an area. Isn't always done for exploration work, but it can be an important part of biogeochemical studies to understand what microbes are living there. It's always worth remembering too that you've got lots of different variety in bacteria. They're often as different to each other as we are to creatures like insects, but it's hard for us to conceptualize that because they're all a single cell organisms. So there's a lot of crazy amounts of different life forms that are found, just within that single cellular organism kind of domain. So you've got 5 of the 31 phyla in the animal kingdom. There's things like chordates for humans, other mammals, fish, reptiles, birds. You've got lots of different phyla, just different types of worms. And for bacteria, there's 40 different phyla that all have lots of different behaviors. Some are more common than others. A lot of them start with A for whatever reason, so you quickly get through that part of the alphabet. And then there's lots of different bacterial phyla, and they're still being described today. So 40 is probably not the final number. It'll keep going up. All that's just to prep you a little bit for showing some examples of this from different sites. So you can collect a sample of soil and then go through, understand what its behavior is, and know what microbes live there. It doesn't tell you what they do, but tells you which ones live there. That's kind of a cheaper technique just to understand the overall behavior of the microbial community in that case. And you can see mostly we've got actinobacteria from all these sites we looked at in the semi-arid environments. And these are fairly hardy bacteria that can cope with things like high levels of UV, that sort of thing. And that's quite helpful when you're living in the outback in a soil that doesn't always get that much water. And you do have variation between different host rock environments. So the one that had some different values was Queen Sally, slightly higher amount of acidobacteria there, where you had the highest amounts of cobalt arsenates in the surface. That seems to have triggered a response in that bacterial community to get more acidobacteria with the higher amounts of acidity in the local soil. Returning to techniques that we're probably more familiar with as geologists and geochemists is X-ray fluorescence microscopy. And we found this was from the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility in Grenoble, beamline ID 21. Unfortunately, we couldn't travel there ourselves. This was research conducted in 2022, so it's still difficult to travel overseas at that time, but we were able to send our samples, and then we would run the beamline remotely 16 hours a day in Australia, and the beamline scientists ran it for the other 8 hours while we slept. So in some ways, that's actually a good pathway forward for synchrotron research if you can do that kind of study, because you can have people sleeping at regular hours rather than sleeping at very strange hours when the experiment actually finishes if you're all in the same place. So there's some merit, but haven't actually been to that particular beamline yet, but do have the results from it. So it's interesting how things can work out now with modern technologies like Zoom and screen transfers. So for cobalt, we found it mainly associated with manganese, and in the form of cobalt manganese oxide nanoparticles. We'll show the nanoparticle data a bit later on. So cobalt manganese is shown in this false color map: red, green, blue, cobalt, red, manganese, blue. Where are they? Well, they're always found together. So that's why it's all purple on the right-hand side. It's cobalt and manganese being found in the same locations. On the left, we've got some examples from Mount Cobalt, where the cobalt oxide nanoparticle clusters were just cobalt there, no manganese in that place. But otherwise, all the sites we looked at, whether it was pyrite or oxide hosted, it was cobalt plus manganese found in the regolith environment. Now, we also used something called Zanes. I'll show the results of these in a more probably palatable format soon afterwards. It's an energy variable technique. So you move the energy that you have. Let's grab the laser pointer up for this one. So the energy will start at 7.7 kilo electron volts, and then you move it slowly across from 7.7 up to 7.84, and using a smaller step size at 7.74 to look at this oxidation zone. This is a somewhat not the cleanest data you'll ever see, because the cobalt's in a relatively small concentration, but the positions of these edges and the behavior after the edge is achieved is indicative of different oxidation states. So you take some standards and compare with those to understand what you have in different sites. Oops. Yep, there we go. Okay, and so looking at manganese and cobalt, we saw them found together in the previous slide. Just flip back here, remind you. So cobalt, manganese overlapping there. We've got manganese as an atomic number of 25, cobalt's 27. So both transition metals. Manganese, so, is considerably more common, about 30 times more manganese in the crust than cobalt. That's why we see it a lot more often. Oxidation states, manganese include that +4, which can help it to form some very insoluble oxide minerals. Well, more minerals have been defined as well, but if you look at the sulfides, cobalt's much more of a sulfide dominant mineral in terms of what's been defined, and there's relatively less manganese, sulfur, arsenic minerals compared to cobalt in proportion. And here's an interesting mineral of cobalt oxide that's a cobalt dominant one. Don't believe we had too much of this, because cobalt was normally found with the manganese. But in places where there's lots of cobalt, like the DRC, you can have cobalt minerals forming like heterogenite, and this unusual one called guite. Easy enough crystal structure. It's a spinel. As we know, many common spinels, but this is a rarer one. It's just cobalt in all the positions of the spinel. So cobalt 2+, 2 cobalt 3+ is O4. It's a bit like if you've placed in magnetite all the ions of cobalt, that's what guite is. And it was actually found, a rare example of a new mineral was actually found to form a bulk part of an ore deposit. 20% of Sycamine's mine is guite for the cobalt resource. Hard to process if you don't know what you actually have, mineralogically speaking. So it's a rare example of a new mineral that actually forms an ore deposit, in a sense. Another example of that is jadarite for lithium in Serbia. So cobalt manganese minerals, well, there's haussmannite as well, which is the manganese spinel, Mn3O4. So do we have any minerals defined for cobalt and manganese together, as we seem to be seeing in our examples of the regolith geochemistry? We don't. So there's no official mineral for CO Mn2O4 or MnCO2O4, neither yet defined. I would say they probably exist, but we haven't seen them yet. So that will be an interesting one to look for in the future. Probably have them in the samples, but in such tiny amounts, it's difficult to get a crystal structure and all the other detail that you require. And here's an example of SEM of heterolite, which is a zinc manganese oxide, another spinel. And that also, potentially, if we did find a manganese cobalt oxide, it would look something like this under the microscope. Lots of minerals out there, many spinels, probably plenty more to find and describe. Talked about spinel and nanoparticles. Now we get to see some nanoparticle results. So there's techniques in single particle ICP-MS that count the amounts of cobalt contained nanoparticles in each sample. You can do this in many different elements. Sulfur poses some challenges, but elements like metals are not too hard to count. So we can see a couple of examples of size distributions here found by counting single particles passing through the ICP-MS system. And you've got, for the lateritic cobalt, quite small, 35 nanometer mean size particles. On the right, up to 110. So it's a much larger size distribution. So the overlap's actually pretty minimal. This is over at the sulfur arsenide location, suggesting a lower degree of or time to actually weather compared to the outcropping laterite over on the left-hand side. You can couple single particle ICP-MS with time of flight, and that gives you the elemental composition of the particles, not just the amount of cobalt containing particles, but the elemental composition within particles. This only worked for the concentrations of nanoparticles that were larger, so didn't get it for every single sample, but ones that we did, very interesting results to see. This was one of the samples from Pyrite Hill in the Broken Hill Cobalt project. We found manganese up at 61%. And then we had cobalt at, I should say, 61% of the particles here. The manganese is about 76% and cobalt 24% in those particles. So it's probably a spinel type particle with a bit more manganese than one of the cobalt sites. The overall percentage at the bottom is the percentage of those particles that are there. And the circles, pie charts allow you to get the percentage of the elements within those. Then you've got particles, 22% that are dominant in titanium with some manganese and a bit of cobalt. And then also ones that are dominant in iron, which you didn't see as much of in the synchrotron X-ray fluorescence microscopy, but they might have been having the iron dominating over the cobalt because there is that overlap. And without those high resolution monochromators that are available at ESRF, you can't always tell iron and cobalt apart. So that might be why we didn't see any of these sort of textures in the synchrotron work. Whereas Mount Cobalt is much higher cobalt, and we saw 85% of the particles being cobalt with arsenic, plus oxygen 2, cobalt plus manganese there, I should say. And then we've got over just a few percent is cobalt plus arsenic. That's probably more your cobalt arsenate nanoparticles there. Titanium dominant ones here again, but just 5% this time, and also some iron dominant ones with a bit of cobalt in them as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see molar fraction of manganese compared to cobalt, and that was a 3:1 molar fraction for manganese to cobalt there, which is basically what we're seeing over on the left-hand side in that larger pie chart with the cobalt being dominated by manganese. There's a 1:3 ratio, probably being found in spinel type nanoparticles there. And then looking at more at that Zanes, I showed you some examples of these figures before. Then you compare with your standards. So you have a standard for cobalt 2, mixed cobalt oxides, then cobalt 3. And then we had 3 distinct groups of spectra here for the cobalt 2, mixed, and cobalt 3, all found at that one site. And then you can also do this by doing derivatives on the right-hand side that's shown here. So you got the cobalt 2 reference, cobalt 3 reference, and then the samples that kind of match those up most effectively from the Queen Sally samples shown on the left-hand side. Now I've got the derivative on the right-hand side. Lots of different ways to look at the oxidation state variety, and this is one of the very good ones. Does require synchrotron though. There's no benchtop way to do Zanes yet, but I suspect we may see that in the future as X-ray techniques for benchtops improve. There's already micro XRF now becoming quite popular as a technique. And then one of the ways to actually visualize this, so the last slides is a little bit harder to see. You can see the variety of where the peaks are found, but it's relatively difficult to actually see those happening when you're actually looking at the samples. So for this case, say you've got cobalt 3 standard in the pink and the cobalt 3 from the analytical sample in red. They've got similar shapes in the over here, but you have to actually group them together to understand a bit more about those behaviors. And PCA gives an example of doing that. So that sort of cluster analysis. So analytical samples here are shown with triangles, and then the references are shown for cobalt 2 in circles, cobalt 2 and 3 in X's, cobalt 3 in pluses. So any triangles, you see the analytical samples across these next 2 slides. So for that Queen Sally example, cobalt sulfur arsenide I just showed, we had examples of all different oxidation state behaviors being found here. So it's quite a dynamic environment with cobalt, all different oxidation states, including both in the same compound, so same point of the spectra that was taken. when it going across to the pyrite hosted, it was all found as mixed cobalt 2 and 3. Just the one sample that was mostly towards fully oxidized cobalt 3. Whereas at Young's Cobalt Prospect in South Australia, we found cobalt either as cobalt 2 or cobalt 3, but not as both. And finally, if the oxide hosted, all the cobalt was in the oxidized cobalt 3 plus state. Probably not too surprising there. It's a very semi-arid environment in the NT. Collecting in the dry season, you've got the high degree of oxidation potential and high amount of manganese there, so encouraging cobalt to oxidize into the highest oxidation state. And cobalt 3 is relatively less mobile than the other oxidation states as well. So trying to put all that together, you can start making some nice cycling diagrams. So things trying to explain some of these behaviors and visualize the different processes that go on. Generally, that starts with cobalt primary minerals, but it could also start for lateritic case. You could put a cobalt ultramafic mineral here, have the cobalt coming out of those. Once cobalt's dissolved, it can go a number of ways. It can go to incorporation of cobalt 3 plus iron oxyhydroxides, such as goethite. It can go to cobalt oxysalts like the erythrite that we showed before, or it could go secondary cobalt oxides, which include things like heterogenite from there. Heterogenite particularly is more a stable one compared to a cobalt arsenate. If you have enough rainfall, then these minerals can dissolve back and you have dissolved cobalt again. That's also when the transport is most likely. If you have a high rainfall event, cobalt can be moved away from a surface environment in sort of dilute forms of cobalt 2 plus. And thinking about what happens if you concentrate all these elements into a place like a battery disposal facility, you don't want to get too much water through those if you've got cobalt in a form that could become mobile and then leach out into surrounding areas. So broadly, looking at outlook and future potential, there's a lot more in Australia to develop in terms of cobalt. There's lots of talk about being a world leader in critical metal production, not much in cobalt at the moment, but we do have the reserves to get that sort of production level up there if the will and the projects are able to be produced and developed in such a way that that can happen. There's still very much a challenge for ethical supply chain. You can't really go out and say, where is my cobalt from at the moment? That's not quite possible yet. It should be in the future to say, where was this cobalt moved from? Did it come from places where people were treated well when they were working on it? Still very much governed by money at the moment, which is always going to be the case, but there needs to be other pressures to encourage things like ethical cobalt production. And from my point of view for research, there's a lot of work on the biogeochemical cycling, how microbes involved, how mobile is cobalt around deposits, does it come out of things like cobalt in pyrite? Lots of those questions, and as others have tried before, and there's been some success in these sort of overall techniques, can we use natural processes to concentrate cobalt? Is there a way that nature already makes cobalt into a concentrated solution? Can we use that to actually produce cobalt in some way using that analog as a production mechanism? And then just a brief mention of my current work. So I'm part of a collaboration on critical metals known as a regional research collaboration. These were a scheme introduced by the previous federal government. There's 11 regional research collaborations around across the country. A couple are on sort of sustainable energy type questions, and ours in Tasmania is on the this critical metals production, so environmentally sustainable production of critical metals. There's also one in Tasmania on, I believe, forestry as well. And my work particularly looking at the environmental aspects, so looking at cobalt and pyrite. We've got plenty of cobalt and pyrite in Tasmania. No cobalt's been produced before, but there is plenty of cobalt out there. Lots of work on terms of tracking cobalt from ores to waste and understanding the chemistry and how it moves in these different situations. And there's also a lot more work to do with things like ICP-MS and understanding the similarities and differences between having a wet deposition environment, whether for tailings like is shown here or in the delta I showed earlier, and then comparing that to the semi-arid environments where you've got a lot less rain and there's much lower volumes of water around than there are in Western Tasmania to either can be used like in this picture here as a cover, but that can also pose weathering and leaching questions if not managed adequately. So with that, thank you all for attending today and happy to take some questions now or afterwards get in touch on LinkedIn or email. Happy to talk about cobalt at any point. Thank you.